Welcome to the Drake Group's webinar series on critical issues in collegiate athletics. Today's discussion, the transgender athlete in girls and women's sports, the collision of science, law, and social justice explained. Our moderator is DONNA LOPIANO, president of the Drake Group.
Remember that while few webinars ever get to all audience questions because of limited time, one of the features of the Drake webinar series is to distribute Q&As, follow-up notes to all attendees that provide answers to questions we don't get to during the program. The notes also will contain a link to a recording of today's webinar, so you will have access to slide data and other content, as well as information on the next webinar in the series. In case you are not familiar with the Drake Group or LRT Sports, the notes will provide you with links so you can learn more and help support our efforts. The Drake Group is an academic think tank working to better educate Congress, higher education leaders, and athletics administrators about critical issues in intercollegiate athletics. We believe that college sport can retain all of its special contributions to the development of participants and the excitement and community it brings to higher education, while still protecting athletes from economic exploitation, academic exploitation, sex, race, and other forms of discrimination, and physical and mental abuse. The purpose of this webinar is to give policymakers as much information as possible on science, law, and social justice that deals with the question of whether eligibility for participation in competitive girls and women's sports should be based on an individual's biological sex, gender identity, or a combination of the two. What has created contention over this question is the collision of two important principles: competitive fairness and safety in sport, with the basic tenets of social justice, that people should not be treated differently because of immutable differences over which they have no control. So before we start, let me emphasize a few things about the conversation we are about to have. First, this conversation is about interscholastic, intercollegiate, and Olympic and competitive club sports. It's not about recreational sports, not about physical education, not about intramurals, spaces in which learning sport skills and experiencing sport as an enjoyable social construct takes precedent over determining winners. Second, it's important to acknowledge that conversations in this space have become extraordinarily polarized, politicized, and toxic, partly because the issue is so important and emotional to so many, but in no small part because, unfortunately, so many in our society are living in isolated information bubbles in which they seldom hear opposing views, and they've succumbed to a practice of hating, name calling, and in other ways disrespecting those with whom they disagree. Thus, an important ground rule today is respecting each other's voice and tone, especially with their questions, and even if we disagree. Third, most of today's audience are students and policymakers who may be novices at the language of gender identity and the science of biological sex. While we've distributed a glossary of terms that may be encountered in this program, we cannot expect that folks will be polished or fluent with new languages, and we cannot interpret mistakes as expressions of disrespect. We ask all attending to assume the best intentions of each other and hope that patience and generosity abound. We also emphasize that the conversation today is conducted in an educational space in which safety is paramount. No one should be afraid that asking a question will invoke a negative accusation. Fourth, we want to emphasize to policymakers, especially those who are novices in the gender identity space, that not all transgender girls and women are the same. They may identify with the binary or not, and they may be at different stages of transition. So they are individuals with significant gender identity and biological differences that are important to recognize. If you have gray hair like mine, or have never, well, if you have gray hair like mine, it's likely you grew up never having met a transgender person, or not knowing you did and thinking that all transgender people wanted to change their bodies in some way to conform to their gender identity. Thus, it's really important that everybody accept the fact that competitive sports policy must not only address the needs of cis girls and women, females at birth, who don't identify as transgender, but we must also consider the needs of transgender girls and women who are not all the same and wish to be included in girls and women's sport. For example, some transgender girls and women have never experienced male puberty and do not have male biological advantages in sport. Some have experienced male puberty but mitigated their biological advantage. Some have experienced male puberty and may be insufficiently mitigated, or have chosen not to take gender-affirming hormones or to surgically change their bodies, thereby retaining their biological advantage. And then there are some athletes whose birth sex may be male or female, who have non-binary gender identities or who are gender fluid. We must also include transgender boys and men, birth sex female, who do not wish to change their bodies and wish to compete in sport consistent with their biological sex. Last, we must also include intersex athletes, individuals with differences in sexual development that may or may not result in biological advantage. Bottom line, we have to appreciate the diversity of expression permitted in the gender identity space and the diversity of individual needs which must be accommodated in girls and women's sport. Fifth, a primary reason for this webinar is to urge informed policymakers not to evade their responsibility to make these important policy decisions. These decisions cannot be left to state legislators who may have selfish political motivations. Such decisions should not be left to the courts, who are often handed esoteric cases, take years to decide, and fail to come up with judgments that are broadly applicable solutions. Sixth, I think it's important to point out that the current debate pits the victims against the victims. Cis girls and women continue to be discriminated against with regard to the promise of Title IX. Yep. It's going on 50 years after Title IX. 80% of the sport leaders in this space are men. Discrimination against girls and women in sport is not a priority for the current group of decision makers. Transgender girls and women are being discriminated against by laws mandating women's sports participation according to birth sex. These laws are passed by state legislatures who are composed primarily of men. Discrimination against transgender girls and women is not a priority for these folks either. I bring this up not to attack men, but to make all of us aware that there are those who have failed to allocate equal resources to women and who do not mind women fighting with each other over a smaller piece of the pie. Rather, I'm saying this to emphasize the importance of all women, administrators and athletes to aggressively enter this decision-making space. Last, I want to comment on who the stakeholders are in this policy discussion and the purposeful composition of this panel. There are two primary stakeholders. One, all girls and women athletes, and two, all transgender girls and women athletes, a subset of that larger group. Just to give you a sense of what this group is, there are 7.8 million adolescent girls in grades 6 to 12 enrolled in public and private high schools, and approximately 300,000 women in public and private colleges participating in competitive sport today inside and outside of school. And we have no idea, we do not know the non-school participation numbers of women in sport. All girls and women have benefited from separate sex sport. Congress realized that way back in 1975, when Title IX was passed, if there was only one basketball team open to boys and girls would get shortchanged being selected. And as a result, they created separate sex sport to fix that. With regard to the second set of stakeholders, Transgender girls and women athletes. There is no data on transgender sport participants. However, we can extrapolate some numbers, and we should. The latest 2017 data says that 0.7% of all adolescents and young adults aged 13 to 24 are transgender. But we have no data on the girl-boy split in that group. And we have no national data on the participation of transgender girls and women in sport. But if you assume that these percentages are the same and you assume an equal split of men and women, we can approximate that there are about 56,000 trans girls and about 2,100 trans women in college who are participating in sports. And we have no idea of the number outside of the education system. Both trans girls and females who play competitive sports have a stakeholder interest in competitive sport policy. Second, and last, really a few words about our panel. We have both cis women and trans women on the panel. All of them are LGBTQ advocates their entire lives. They've been LGBTQ athletes. Because the Drake Group believes that the categorical exclusion of all trans girls and women from women's sport is discriminatory, we have chosen not to amplify the voice of that position on this panel. We acknowledge the bias of the panel in favor of categorical inclusion of all girls and women in girls and women's sports. Therefore, today's policy discussion is not about exclusion. It is about how to fairly include all girls and women in girls and women's sport, given the fact that they both have respective transgender girls and women and cis girls have the same desire for respective good competitive sport, fair competitive sport, and they both have a keen social commitment to each other. And so, sorry for the long-winded intro, but especially for novices, this is a very complex space, and we want you to have a feel for this complex space. And now I'm honored to introduce our panelists, but before I do, I want everybody who's late in coming to understand that our host for this, the internet has gone down. And I am trying to manage this for the first time. So I apologize if we're a little stilted here. Nancy, can I ask you if Joanna is on?
No, I don't. I sent her the link, both text and email, and I don't see her on.
All right.
Do you? Somebody else?
No. Okay.
Can you call her?
I have not called her.
If you can call her, Nancy, that'd be great. Okay. So here was our plan, and we're going to change the batting order as soon as the player comes into the dugout. Batting first and handling science is JOANNA HARPER, a medical physicist and PhD candidate at Loughborough University in the UK. And she joins us from the UK. JOANNA is a transgender athlete and former elite marathoner. Second up and handling the law, and she's probably going to be the leadoff batter, we can't get JOANNA on, is Ncaa HOGSHEAD MAKAR, triple Olympic gold medalist in swimming, CEO of Champion Women, and a nationally recognized civil rights lawyer. Batting third and addressing the societal impact of separate sex sport is DONNA deVARONA, a two-time Olympic gold medalist swimmer, Title IX advocate, architect of the Ted Williams Olympic and Amateur Sports Act, who currently serves on the IOC and US sport governance boards and committees. Batting fourth in the cleanup spot and addressing the lessons of history regarding sexual orientation and gender identity, discrimination in sport is MARTINA NAVRATILOVA, winner of more Grand Slam titles than any other male or female pro tennis player and the longtime face of LGBTQ rights. Batting fifth is our most experienced high school club and international sports administrator, TRACY SUNDLUN, the founding director of the National Scholastic Track and Field championships. He's a former college coach and 6-time Olympic coach and manager who will tackle the sports policy options. And our last batter is Juniper Eastwood, the first NCAA Division I openly transgender athlete competing on a women's sports team, who will share her transition experience with hormone suppression and thoughts about meaningful competition. So JOANNA, we're back on track. Thank you so much for doing this, JOANNA. I just finished introducing you, so go to it.
Okay. So I'm JOANNA, and I'm going to talk about the science and policy behind transgender athletes. Let's see. So before I get to that, though, I'd like to talk about the importance of women's sports. The reason why we have women's sports, at least at higher levels, is because we want to see women succeeding in sports. And women cannot succeed in most sports if they have to compete against men, not because women are any less brave or talented, but simply the biological characteristics that men have preclude women from competing equitably against men in most sports. When men go through puberty, they get huge increases in testosterone to where testosterone levels are 10 to 15-fold higher in men than in women. This leads to performance gaps in virtually all sports. These gaps can range from 10 to 50% depending on the sport. Larger performance gaps are on sports where upper body strength and muscle mass are important. And beyond talking about a performance gap between the top women and the top men, it's important to note that it's not just at that level. There are many hundreds, and in some sports, thousands of men who can routinely outperform the very top women in most sports. And so if women have to compete against men, there's no women winning Olympic medals, there's no women earning professional sports contracts. None of this happens. I would suggest that if you look back 100 years ago at the lives of women, there were many things that that have changed in the preceding century. Voting, working outside the home, higher education. But one of the most important is the rise of women's sports that has occurred particularly in the latter half of the 20th century and the early part of the 21st century. And so beyond just talking about sports, it's important to the lives of all women that women be allowed the chance to be successful in sports. However, having said that, it's also important to note that transgender women aren't the same as cisgender men. First of all, the gender identity that drives the lives of both trans women and trans men is largely or perhaps entirely biological in nature. And for instance, transgender women as a population group would rather starve themselves to look like models than to put on muscle mass to be athletic. Now, that's as a population group. Certainly, there are trans women who have been successful in men's sports. Caitlyn Jenner won an Olympic gold medal. Philippa York won the polka dot jersey at the Tour de France. June Eastwood was the #1 runner on a men's team in Division I sports. And even when I was young, I ran a marathon time that put me in the top 20 men of all in all Canada. But just talking about a few successful trans athletes doesn't look at population statistics, and it doesn't explain what goes on with trans athletes. And the truth is, we know very, very little about trans athletes. However, one thing we can say for certain is that on average, transgender women are taller, bigger, and stronger than cisgender women. And this is true even after hormone therapy. And these size and strength differences are certainly advantages in many sports. So the idea that trans women have advantages in sports cannot in any way be disputed. However, we allow advantages in sports. The classic example is that the baseball diamond gives left-handed baseball players many advantages over right-handed baseball players. However, what we don't allow in sports is overwhelming advantage. We don't, for instance, let heavyweight boxers get in the ring with lightweight boxers. And here's the difference in these two scenarios. Despite the fact that left-handed baseball players have advantages over right-handed baseball players, we can have meaningful sport between the two groups. In fact, it's seen as one of the pluses of the sport of baseball, how left-handers and right-handers compete against one another. There's no meaningful sport when big boxers get in the ring with a little boxer. The big boxer simply wins every time. So the important question to ask isn't, do trans women have advantages, but rather, can trans women and cis women compete against one another in meaningful competition? And to start to look at this question, I'm going to look at 3 papers that have been published in the last year. 2 of them are reviews of the hormone-based changes that occur in non-athletes. And it's important to note that these are non-athletes, and they probably have limited things to say about athletes. But again, given the paucity of data on trans athletes, both these studies are important. The 3rd study is a study of the changes in performance in transgender service personnel on 3 fitness tests. Again, not necessarily trained, not necessarily athletes, but certainly fitness trained people. And so this study is certainly important. I'm going to start with the study that I co-authored. And there are 2 main takeaways from our study. The first is that the hemoglobin or hematocrit levels of trans women will change from male to female levels within 4 months of hormone therapy. That's roughly a 10% loss of hemoglobin. And while there are many factors that are important to endurance, sports, success, hemoglobin levels are probably the single most important factor. However, on the other hand, that the strength loss in this non-athletic cohort was fairly modest, roughly 5 to 10%, and substantially smaller than the strength difference between cis men and cis women. And this held true for strength or strength-related factors going out to approximately 36 months. The second review by Emma Hilton and Tommy Lundberg focused very much on these strength differences and on the modest strength losses that occur in trans women. And one of the things that they said was that even after hormone therapy, trans women will be almost as strong as cis men because of this small strength loss. And in particular, if we look at hand grip strength, which several of these studies did, cis men are 57% stronger than cis women. And if trans women only have a modest decrease, then the hand grip strength should be nowhere near equivalent. However, what Hilton and Lundberg failed to note was that even before starting hormone therapy, the non-athletic trans women had hand grip strengths that were 10 to 14% lower than cis men. So that Hilton and Lundberg noted that after hormone therapy, the trans women had a 17% grip strength advantage. And while that's a significant advantage, it's less than 1/3 of the 57% grip strength advantage that cis men have over cis women. So certainly the idea that trans women have strength advantages is obviously true, but that these are on the order of the strength advantages that men have over women is certainly not shown by these studies, and it's something that doesn't hold up to closer examination. So let's look at the Roberts study. As I mentioned, it's a study showing both trans men and trans women who are Air Force personnel and what happened to their physical capabilities in 3 fitness tests. The first of these tests was a 1.5 mile run. The trans women in the study lost 12% of their speed over the first year, and the speed is measured in time, which is in seconds here. So 600 seconds is 10 minutes, and 900 seconds is 15 minutes. The trans women lost 12% of their speed in the first year, but that was not enough to change the, to eliminate the roughly 20% gap between the cis men and cis women in the study, nor the gap between the trans women where they started and the cis women. Now, this 20% gap is substantially larger than the 10 to 12% gap measured in trained distance runners. And it is something to point out that they didn't track the training of their participants. That the trans men, it should be noted, completely made up from the level of trans cis women to cis men. The second study that the second fitness test that they looked at was number of push-ups per minute, and the trans women in this study started with a 31% advantage over the cis women in the number of push-ups per minute. After 2 years, this advantage completely went away. The trans men started just above the cis women and wound up equivalent to the cis men. And I think this is sort of an important test, although again, without measuring training, it's hard to be certain. But there are many sports where strength is one part of the success of the sport, but not the whole thing. And that holds true for the number of push-ups per minute. Obviously, upper body strength is important, but muscular endurance, technique, and cardiovascular endurance are all important in this skill. So this may be a proxy for a number of team sports, but again, there are a number of caveats here. Lastly, they looked at the number of sit-ups per minute, and the trans women started equivalent to the cis men and wound up equivalent with the cis women. Interestingly enough, the trans men started equivalent to the cis men and wound up superior to the cis men. So this is the first time I've seen anything where trans men outperform cis men in any sort of sport or exercise test. I don't think it means that trans men are going to be taking over men's sport anytime soon. So while these papers in the last year are useful, they're not studies on trans athletes. And that's what I'm doing here at Loughborough University. I should note that I have a dual role at the university. I'm a visiting fellow for transgender athletic performance, but I'm also just a regular PhD student as well. But beyond looking at what you can see in the lab, I think one of the most important things that you can look at is population studies, if you will. And I think the single most important population study that can be done is in the NCAA, as there are over 200,000 women every year competing in NCAA sports. Trans people make up somewhere between 0.5% and 1% of the population. And so we should be seeing somewhere on the order of 1,500 trans women competing in NCAA sports every year if trans women were equally represented. We don't actually know how many trans women are competing in women's sports now, but it's probably fewer than 50, and it's certainly fewer than 100. And trans women have been allowed to compete in women's sport in the NCAA for 10 years now. And rather than taking over NCAA sports, trans women are still hugely underrepresented in NCAA sports 10 years after this hormone rule came into effect. I would also note that June Eastwood, who's pictured here, was roughly equally successful before transition as a men's middle distance runner as she was after transition as a women's middle distance runner. Earlier this week, I spoke to somebody at the University of Oklahoma, and she said she's working hard to prepare for the day when the University of Oklahoma will see its first transgender athlete. And I asked her, well, hold it now. The University of Oklahoma is one of the most storied athletic programs in the US. And you're telling me that in the last 10 years, there's not been a single trans athlete at the University of Oklahoma. And she said, yes, that is the case. And so I think that again is indicative of the huge underrepresentation that we see in NCAA sports. So what does everything I've seen lead me to suggest in terms of policies? Well, I think it leads me to a two-step approach. I think when we're talking about international policy or even policy where we're talking about people who are on the verge of qualifying for international sports, I think it's absolutely appropriate to put restrictions on transgender athletes. I think specifically trans women should be required to reduce their testosterone levels via hormone therapy, and it is ideal to have them within the female range. Exactly what that leads to as an upper limit is somewhat difficult to say for sure, but there are some sports where it might not be enough to simply to restrict testosterone. The International Volleyball Federation, for instance, says that they will review trans women on a case-by-case basis to compete at international level volleyball, and will not allow any nation to have more than one trans woman on their national team at a time. And I don't think these are unreasonable restrictions. As of yet, no trans woman has qualified for her national team. So they haven't had to put these rules into place, but they do exist, and I don't think they're unreasonable. What I do think is unreasonable, however, is to ban trans women from sports. I don't think that is appropriate, and it's not anything that I can stand behind, even at the international level. Now, on the other hand, when we talk about recreational sports and at the local level, trans athletes are hugely underrepresented in grassroots sports. Here in the UK, there are 14 million people registered with the Football Association, or soccer, as you would say there, showing just, you know, how incredibly invested in that sport British people are. The Football Association here has registered 23 trans people out of those 14 million people. So what we need to do at grassroots levels is we need to create inclusive policies. We need to increase the privacy of gender-specific locker rooms. We need to think very carefully about the uniforms that people wear to allow for more flexibility, to allow trans people in. And there are any number of other things that can be done to increase inclusivity in sports. And part of that is simply to allow people who might not look exactly like everybody else to be in a sport and in a category where they feel comfortable. And so those are two very different policy suggestions, depending on whether we are talking about high-level sport or lower-level sport. Lastly, I'd like to say that the controversy over trans athletes is not going to go away anytime soon. As a scientist, I happen to think that the science matters is very important. I think as we get better data, we'll get better policy. But I also think beyond the science, that it's important to have rational discourse. Unfortunately now, we tend to have in these discussions, people at one end or the other saying it's not fair to have trans athletes compete, or trans women are women and trans rights aren't up for debate. While these are pithy little statements, they don't necessarily lend themselves to compromise or any rational discourse. And I think we definitely need to find some middle ground. If you're interested in looking at these issues in more detail, I would modestly recommend my book, Sporting Gender. And lastly, allow me to say that I get a lot of publicity, but there's a big team at Loughborough University that is responsible for all the research we're doing, and it is by no means just JOANNA HARPER. Thanks for listening.
JOANNA, thank you so much. Yeah, that was very special. Okay, Nance, you're up for law.
Well, thank you, JOANNA. I think so much of what the law is going to say about transgender inclusion and how it is that we include transgender athletes into the women's category is going to depend on what that science tells us. So thank you very much for that. Frankly, I did not understand everything that you said, but we'll circle back. Slide 21 really threw me. Okay, I'm a civil rights lawyer and I run a nonprofit called Champion Women. We provide legal advocacy for girls and women in sports. I'm just going to go through how the law developed because it is a unique place in the law. Okay, so we're going to talk about this general non-discrimination. We're going to talk about how we got this sports exception. And then we have this really unsettled, how the law could go in different ways, and then what we're going to be doing moving forward. So Generally speaking, the law in lots of different areas is a general non-discrimination law, which based on somebody's immutable characteristics, something like race, sex, religion, etc., that somebody cannot be discriminated against because of those. So, and typically we, up until very recently, sex has been defined as biological sex. There are exceptions that are permitted for when it is that a court or an administrative agency will allow for to have some differences. And one is if there's a very good reason to differentiate based on sex, and there's a closeness in the connection between the means and the ends are very tight. Okay, so it's actually much harder to engage in race discrimination. You'll notice that we don't have formal race discrimination in sport, but we do have this sex segregation. So as Joanna did such a good job, the sex-linked distinctions that we're most familiar with are presumed to meet this two-part test. Okay, so it's toilets, dressing rooms, prisons, and sports. Okay, sports regularly discriminates in different ways to achieve certain goals. So let's not pretend that sort of everybody is let in to be able to participate in sports at all times. That I mean, the International Olympic Committee regularly says it is a human right to participate in sports, but we still have weight categories, right? We still have age categories. We still have geography. I got third place at Olympic trials and did not get to compete in one of my best events at the Olympics because the United States is only allowed to send 2 people to the Olympics. We have time categories. We have like A, B, and C times. We have, when those of you, and for high schools in particular, but we have like the size of the school, right? Is it a AAA, quadruple A, right? Single A school? We have different disciplines, and some sports are subject to drug testing and other sports are not. So we have all these different ways that we already segment sport, okay? Okay, so the standard argument for a sports exception and for a protected female category is that competitive sport classifies athletes on the basis of sex to protect the female category for purposes of, number one, achieving sex equality so that girls and women have the same opportunities that boys and men do. One of the things DONNA LOPIANO was saying in her introductory remarks is how that 90% of higher ed does not do this. They do not provide equality for girls and women to be able to just participate in sports. 2 is ensuring safety in contact sports settings. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a second. And 3rd is producing value for the school or the sport governing body like USA Track and Field or USA Swimming when it showcases the best female athletes and producing the social benefits that flow to individual female champions and their communities. Okay, so we have, we use sex as a sorting tool. So sex at birth and exposure to male levels of testosterone during puberty and throughout their athletic career are very narrowly tailored, okay? The performance gap between males as a group and females as a group is a rationale. You'll notice in Joanna's talk that she sort of takes it as a given what these big differences are between men and women, particularly men who have the male puberty advantage. So an exposure in natal males and male levels of testosterone starting at puberty and throughout the athletic career is the primary driver of the performance gap. USADA and WADA, the World Anti-Drug organizations, if somebody tests positive for steroids in particular, like testosterone, they are banned for life. And why? Because it gives them advantages that cannot be unwound. So one of the things that Joanna talked about was what can an athlete do to unwind their sex-linked advantage? And so that's what we're talking about, is like, how can we accommodate people to be able to participate via the law? So Title IX, exception for sport. Title IX, you all probably know, was passed in 1972. It is a general non-discrimination statute. It was based on Title VI, which was passed 8 years earlier, that barred discrimination based on race, color, national origin. But pretty much you just take those words out, you put in the word sex, and you've got the same statute. Both those statutes are governed by the Department of Education. And okay, so we have this, so Title IX passes. Schools right away said, how does this apply when it comes to schools, when it comes to sports? And the Department of Education, what is now the Department of Education, came up with implementing regulations that recognize sex-based segregation in sport. In other words, the implementing regulations did not require one team, like one basketball team, and just see who makes it. They specifically allow for sex segregation, and they specifically allow, particularly, and they were very cognizant of the contact sports exemption. They were very aware of safety as a reason for having this sex segregation. So, and it's interesting to note again that in 1988, so, you know, Title IX had to get passed twice, long story that I won't bore you with, but it did have to get passed twice. The second time it got passed was because they wanted to preserve women's sports opportunities in schools. It was one of the major motivating factors that, that led to the passage of the statute for that second time. So this exception to the general non-discrimination law has powered numerous positive social changes. And because the regulation was formally approved by Congress, it has been treated with quasi-statutory deference in the courts. It's one of the few times when, after the Department of Education came up with the regulations, it got approved by Congress. So there's really no debate about the statute and the rules that implement it. All right, so playing safety, I just wrote PASM up there because schools are always responsible, even if it's, say, male on male, and you've got two football teams and they're wildly not, they're not very well matched. The school's liable if somebody ends up getting hurt because they didn't do a good job of matching the skill level between the parties. We also have the contact sports exemption that says that even if a school is not required to start a women's program, if it is a contact sport, it can, but it's not required to. So we have got playing safety is one of the issues. When we talk about safety, we're not talking about anything other than on the field safety. Okay. 2 is equal opportunities. Hafer versus Temple. Temple University tried to say that it had this one team, and then they had a quote unquote B team. They had this this other team that was a affirmative action team, and the court said that's ridiculous. It says men and women right here, so that failed. In Cohen versus Brown University, the university tried everything that they could to try to limit the number of women who were participating. In Bidinger versus Quinnipiac, lots and lots of cases. I could like fill the whole thing saying that the law requires that schools provide equal opportunities for girls and women in sports. There are 2 other tests. One is, are you expanding the opportunities for women, number 1, or I should say that's test number 2. And then 3 is whether or not you're meeting the interests and abilities, like there's nobody knocking at the door. But those 2 tests are very hard to meet because A, it's been 50 years, and B, because women and girls are so interested in playing sports. There is so much knocking at the door. Okay, so equal opportunities, right? We got lots of case law here. Equal treatment in McCormick versus the School District of Merrimack. The court held the importance of allowing high school girls to be able to participate in those postseason competitions, that this was sex discrimination not to allow them to be treated equally. The boys got this postseason competition, the girls did not. Then in the Parker versus Franklin County Community Schools, only the boys got to participate in Friday night basketball games and the girls had to compete during the week. And they said, if nothing else, that it gives the imprimatur that girls are not as important. And it's much harder for parents to be able to come to games during the week. It's much harder for, participating in AP classes. But they would never get the same level of attention. They would never be able to develop a fan base if they were always relegated to competing during the week. Okay, so we've got all these case examples of treating women and girls equally based on the sex of the parties. All right, so we've got these challenges to the current law. Prioritizing sex equality. Are we going to prioritize sex equality? Are we going to prioritize and empowering gender minorities? Okay, that 1%, 2%. To make sure that we have women who are on the podium. We have a, when you think of all the societal benefits of seeing women exceed and have them be on the podium, what does that mean for girls and women broadly? What is a societal value produced by protected female category, a space where females can compete only against each other and not against males? What is the harm to the organization's goals that is caused by a transgender woman who could eventually make a final or a podium? An organization meaning, Tracy's organization or a high school or college or say something within the Olympic movement. So the Biden administration's position right now is consistent with these, which is he is equating sex discrimination with gender identity discrimination, being those two things are the same thing, meaning that schools or the Olympic movement or whatever would not be able to make that differential between those, between somebody who identifies, right? But unlike what JOANNA HARPER was saying about all of the mitigation, not even requiring mitigation, okay? And we do need to think of, those of us who are in sport, we need to be thinking about this and we need to come up with rules for how it is that we include transgender girls and women into the girls and women's category, because sport is international. And if the United States wants to host international competitions, they are going to need to be able to enforce the rules of whatever the international federation is. So if you either have full exclusion, states that we've got going on right now, or you have the Equality Act that ends up getting passed and has full inclusion, both of those wouldn't allow for international competition, where, as JOANNA was saying, the rule is that if a transgender woman is participating in the girls and women's category, they have to lower their testosterone levels for a certain amount of time. And that's not possible if sex discrimination is the same thing as gender identity discrimination. Okay, so we've got a lot of resistance and a lot of problems with the resulting legal situation. And one of the things that we're trying to do is to get sport to figure it out. How is it that we can have transgender girls and women participating in the girls and women's category without sort of blowing up the parameters and the very reason why it is that we have this category. We have weight categories for very specific reasons. And even if somebody is horribly weight shamed or is harmed dramatically, by being a certain weight, we still don't let them participate in the 120-pound weight class. So we need to have these parameters for the girls and women's category. We need to figure out, Joanna's showing you about the difficulty of, how do we have somebody roll back their testosterone advantage? And then how do we accommodate people who do not want to change their bodies whatsoever? So that's it for the law. I'm happy to share my slides. Who am I throwing it to?
No, I'm good. Okay, thanks, Vance. And now we're going on to Donna deVARONA. And Donna, here's my question. The debate over separate sex sport was very contentious in 1975. It would kill, if you gave women the chance to play sports and equal opportunity, it would kill men's football and basketball. But it appears that Congress has gotten it right. Men's sports are alive and well. Women's sports opportunities have increased exponentially. They're not there yet. Could you reflect on the societal impact of what Nancy just brought up and what Joanna did too, in terms of the societal impact to the entire category of the women's sports space?
Well, thank you, Donna. And as Nancy mentioned, after 50 years, we still are $1 billion less in support on the collegiate level, and thousands of opportunities are lost every year because we still discriminate against women in sports across the board. And we've had to fight every inch of the way. And so today, I think my job is to put it in perspective, our growth and what we had to deal with 50 years ago. We were all there in the trenches for those novices that are coming to this conversation. And it is true, the implementation of Title IX did explode so many longstanding myths, which some 50 years ago held women back from realizing their human potential in every area. But in sports, there were myths such as women aren't interested in competing in elite sport in college. They are only interested in finding husbands, and their sports will not turn a profit. Women are physically inferior to men. They have smaller lungs and hearts and are not capable of participating in endurance events. Well, look at 1984. The inaugural Olympic gold medal marathoner, Joan Benoit, busted that notion. After the hard work of Kathy Switzer to enter the Boston Marathon, claiming, well, as Kay Switzer, because women weren't allowed in that event. So you look at marathons around the world now and the popularity of long running and how that impacted health around the world. Those women are the ones that have been in the trenches busting the myths. Another myth, the physical exertion required for competitive sports will have an adverse effect on pregnancy and reproduction. Thank you, Carrie Walsh, who on your way to your third Olympic gold medal in beach volleyball, later revealed she had competed while pregnant during the 2012 London Olympics. Or how about this one? Women aren't tough enough. They fold under pressure. Say that to a 1973 worldwide audience of millions who tuned into ABC's television coverage of the Battle of the Sexes when tennis ace and the legendary Billie Jean King beat Bobby Riggs. Or this one. Women who can participate in sports such as boxing or wrestling, as well as team sports, sports in which heavier and more muscular women compete, are either lesbians or tomboys. It's sad to say, but prior to Title IX, these were pejorative terms. The underlying message was intended to intimidate and undermine women's sports, and it came a lot from the collegiate and educational communities. I should point out, however, that female athletes were respected and covered in print and on television pre-Title IX, but mostly if they took part in individual sports such as tennis or golf, or if they were Olympic athletes. Those who adhered to sex object stereotypes, such as attractive gymnasts, figure skaters, swimmers, divers, and skaters, who performed in revealing sports apparel, garnered the most coverage, and the IOC can attest to that in their research. What all female athletes had in common, though, was a very limited future. Back then, Olympic sports were amateur. You couldn't have a sponsor. If you accepted one dime, you were banned from amateur sports. And in that landscape, in the United States, high school and college sports teams basically did not exist in our educational institutions. Girls and women trained outside the system in community and private clubs. So in 1972, the enactment of Title IX sparked a hard-fought cultural evolution on every level. With sports scholarships available for the first time, thousands of female student athletes benefited from newfound opportunities. Before the passage of Title IX, only 1 in 27 high school girls played sports. This figure vacillates now between 1 in 3 that do. Walk into any high school and look at a boys and girls championship banners hanging next to each other from the gymnasium ceiling. Look at school record boards with separate marks set by males and females. Look at the list of boys and girls state and conference champions, individuals and teams. Look at the trophy cases and see male and female athletes equally valued in many of our schools. The times and distances and scores, yes, are different, but they are equally valued. In my year, I could not compete for my high school. So the message to me was the boys are valued. They have a team. They will get a scholarship. You must retire at 17. In 1984, when females were finally allowed to participate in the Los Angeles Olympic Games marathon, barriers to entry in all sports, especially internationally, began to crumble. Just think of this. Women's soccer was not on the Olympic program until 1996. Women's basketball was added in Montreal in 1976, and we still fight to keep softball on the Olympic program. During this summer's Tokyo Olympics, however, because so many leaders that came from this era have infiltrated leadership positions in the international sports movement, the gender balance was almost equal. The enactment and protection of Title IX as it applies to sports has had a global impact as well. America's educational institutions have led the way and are universally envied in how women athletes are supported and accommodated. As a result, the US women's athletes dominate in most sports on the international stage. Research has confirmed that there's more to sports, as we've talked about, than meets the eye with regard to its impact on girls and women. Girls and women who participate in sport are more likely to reach higher levels of education and have greater social and economic mobility, are less likely to engage in destructive behavior, have higher levels of self-esteem, are mentally and physically healthier, and less likely to be sexually assaulted or harassed. And if they are, they will speak out like our gymnasts have. A 2015 study undertaken by the Ernst & Young accounting firm examined the role of sports participation in a female athlete's life after sport. And this was an important study to show how the trajectory can change when an athlete has that foundation. They found female participation in sports provides a promising trajectory into other areas such as business, politics, as well as legal, medical, and scientific professions. And they found that more than 94% of C-suite women executives in Fortune 500 companies had participated in sports, and 52% of them had competed in college. In assessing hiring practices regarding sportswomen, corporate executives expressed interest in hiring more elite women athletes because they commit to a job as a serious profession, see projects through to the completion, and motivate those around them. They build strong teams and work extremely well under pressure while responding positively to critical feedback. Finally, another study undertaken by the Peterson Institute examined women's Olympic medal results by country, indicating that there is a link between a country's GDP and how each country actively supports their women in education, the labor force, and in sports. Bottom line, progress has only been made due to the relentless dedication of an expanding group of leaders who over the decades have fought for inclusion of girls and women on every level of sport and fought every legislative challenge threatening to weaken Title IX. As we continue to explore our topic today, we should all understand that gender identity wasn't on anyone's radar for the first 20 years of Title IX. And now it's time for all of us to create policies that adapt to our evolving sports landscape, because all of the benefits of sport I've just mentioned remedy debilitating cultural stereotypes for any disadvantaged and undervalued population.
Hey, Don, one more quick question. Are there lessons of history from Title IX experience that can be applied to the development of transgender athlete sport policies?
Well, you know, if you look leading up to the enactment of Title IX, the needs of male and female athletes with disabilities became apparent. So 50 years ago, the Paralympics in its present form did not exist. And the same can be said of the Special Olympics or the Gay Games or any of the other populations that decide to create grassroots up to elite level competition. And within these organizations, competitions were created for individuals with different performance abilities. And in all these events, careful attention was always devoted to making sure competition between competitors was fair and safe. You know, indeed, history confirms that sporting organizations have really responded. Athletes with disabilities, for instance, usually choose to remain in Paralympic sport, but some have decided they wanted to participate in sport against athletes without disabilities. Rules were crafted to ensure fair competition. For instance, the artificial appendage to replace a lost limb could not give the Paralympic athlete an advantage over the male or female athlete without a disability. We've seen that in track and field. Neither could the participation of the athlete create an unsafe competition. The policy lesson here is that opportunities for cis women or biological women and opportunities for athletes with disabilities were both protected by enabling the athlete with disabilities to compete against athletes without disabilities, as long as the competition was fair and safe. And at the same time, new fair and safe opportunities were created for previously discriminated against category of athletes with disabilities. The fair competition and safety standard is consistent in all sports competitions. This is why we have weight categories, which we mentioned in wrestling and weightlifting, ensure that no harm comes to the athlete. And it's why we separate, as Nancy said, high school competition into 3A, 4A, and 5A. There is a consistent striving, I think, for all of us, as we've already discussed, to provide fair competition and safety for everyone. And it's why, you know, and we banned performance enhancing drugs that give an unfair advantage. We saw that in 1976 when the East Germans pumped their women with steroids, and in the swimming areas, that country dominated all the events. Title IX created millions of opportunities for cis women consistent with their biological limitations, physical limitations that do not permit fair and sometimes safe competition versus post-puberty advantage in male bodies. The American with Disabilities Act and the Paralympics movement created hundreds of thousands of opportunities for differently abled individuals. More opportunities needed to be created, and they were. Now the needs of transgender girls and women have come to the forefront, and we must again, rise to the challenge of including previously excluded people in competitive sport and create our own policies. And, you know, it's very important that we've all joined today for this conversation. And thank you for having me make my contribution and join my fellow hardworking athletes and leaders in this space.
Hey, thanks, Don. Hey, Martina, almost the same question as I just asked Donna. Are there lessons of history from your experiences with discrimination against athletes with different sexual orientations and gender identities that can be applied to this sport policy issue?
Sure, yeah. So I will probably repeat some of the examples that have been given because they are so important and so vital. History of discrimination against sexual orientation and gender identification people is long and not so storied, but then history of discrimination against all women is not only long, but still ongoing. Women and girls have had to fight long and hard to be able to participate and compete in sports. And as we know, this is still not possible in some countries. But we are now, for now, speaking about the situation of discrimination in our country, in the United States. We remember the heroic action of Catherine Switzer, who in '67 had the audacity to run in the Boston Marathon, which she finished despite the efforts of some men who literally tried to push her off the course and keep her from competing. We remember Title IX, which in 1972 gave women and girls equal access to scholarships and participation in college athletics, and which prohibits sex-based discrimination in schools that receive federal money. I remember the nasty names that I was called when I was still a girl, but a complete tomboy in English vernacular. The nasty names I was called when I came out in '81, when some have said that I should not be able to compete against real women because my being a lesbian somehow gave me an unfair advantage. I remember when Renee Richards had to sue for the right to play on our women's tennis tour. This is back in the 70s, as she was and still is a transsexual woman who was taking hormones and who won her case to compete on the women's tour. I remember the comments we got separately, as well as when we actually played doubles together in 1978. Defending Renee and her right to play on our tour was one of my acts as a fighter for equality, equal treatment, and fair play for all. We must remember also people like the late Renee Portland, who coached Penn State women's team from 80 to 2007, and who proudly proclaimed that she would not allow any lesbians on her team. So when I came out in 81, this was definitely neither a safe nor a prosperous move. But fortunately for me, I played in an individual sport where the only thing that mattered was your ranking. If it was not good enough to get into the tournament, okay, but if it was, then I could play. In this sport, unlike team sports, nobody, not even people like Renee Portland, could keep me from competing. So lucky me. So I have been speaking up for fairness for decades by being an activist, a fundraiser, also a donor for women and girls sports over the years, as well as for the LGBTQI community. And I'm proud of the difference that I have made thanks to the letters and personal exchanges that I've had with women and girls and LGBT people over the years. To be clear, sexual orientation discrimination is different from gender identification discrimination. Inclusion of athletes with non-heterosexual orientation does not affect the competition or the design of separate sex sport. Because separate sex sport actually adjusts for physical advantages of the post-puberty male body, while gender identity does not recognize these differences. Gender identity accepts all bodies without regard to bodies that retain such physical advantages, as we have been talking about. That being said, sport for males and females is a social as well as a competitive construct. The locker room, the bus, the training together every day, the social relationships. So this social construct is equally important for the health and development of both cisgender and transgender individuals. It's important for all of us. The challenge for the sports policy makers is clear. All girls and women, cis girls and women, transgender girls and women, non-binary, gender fluid, intersex, everybody, even trans boys and men who do not want to change their bodies, they all must be welcome and respected under the girls and women's sports umbrella. The rules and construction within women's sport must be adjusted rather than requiring bodily reconstruction. So what does this mean? What is the hard work? I can tell you what hard work isn't. It's not excluding transgender athletes and mandating competitive sports participation by birth sex. That's not it. And it's not calling people transphobic if they question the wisdom of this identical treatment. The hard work is actually imagining something we haven't imagined before, as Nancy and Donna said so well before me. Within girls and women's sport, it's fair competition that continues to provide a space for cis women and comparably mitigated transgender women to excel. Within girls and women's sport, it's imagining an equally fair competitive space among trans girls and women who wish to retain their advantaged bodies. It's okay also. It must be okay to acknowledge and talk about physical differences because they cannot be erased or wished away. It must be okay to imagine and talk about separate scoring or maybe separate competition within the women's sports, if we believe in full inclusion of all gender identities in women's sport. I also remember when a gay athlete's life was at risk entering the locker room. I remember when female champions and athletes were less valued and are still paid less. All of us in women's sports have experienced this lack of respect for difference. Cis women are still getting, oh, pardon my French, as we have talked before, screwed, excuse me, read Title IX. So that fight still goes on, but that's another fight, right? I believe that all women can respect cis and trans differences in the locker room as well as on the track. So if we can just meet in the middle and figure this out, that's exactly what we've been trying to do. And that's why we are here today. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Martina, really. And now for TRACY SUNDLUN, who's over 100 years old. He's our most experienced sports administrator. I'm sure he's struggled with these policy challenges. TRACY, can you comment on the current state of sport policy in the US and worldwide regarding the participation of transgender athletes in girls and women's sports?
100 years? Not quite. But I've had the honor and joy to have been a track coach and then administrator and event organizer for over 50 years at every level, from age group clubs to college to professionals, and even the Olympics and all over the world. And I've always looked to include as opposed to exclude. At the world level of all sports, the international federations rigorously protect the female category in the best interest of their sport. They do so largely by controlling testosterone levels and responding to the latest science. This is not the case domestically in the United States when it comes to the participation of transgender children in sports. It is a terribly disjointed and disappointing landscape, especially as to how it affects girls' high school sports, which has become highly politicized and confusing to the disadvantage of all the participants, transgender and cisgender girls alike, and their parents and loved ones. Some states call for categorical inclusion of transgender girls in high school sports. Some states call for categorical exclusion. Some have conditional inclusion, meaning they allow transgender girls to compete with various conditions imposed. And some states haven't decided and provide no direction at all. Categorical exclusion means that if a transgender woman or girl has never experienced male puberty, had surgery, including a gonadectomy, and been on first puberty blockers and then female gender affirming hormones, and thus has absolutely no male legacy advantages, she is still unable to participate on the girls' team. And without any aspersion intended, conversely, categorical inclusion allows anyone, despite their physiology, to compete on the girls' team by just declaring themselves to be a girl. Per many states' rules, without exaggeration, Bruce Jenner could have won the men's Olympic decathlon with his world record, gone to the press conference and announced that she had been struggling for years and that she was now Caitlin, and immediately began to compete as a woman without any mitigation. And to make matters even more confusing, all the state rules are essentially one size fits all for all sports, while the physiological requirements of many of the sports are quite different. And in fact, the applicable international sports federation rules vary quite a bit from sport to sport. Caitlyn Jenner would be welcome to compete in track and field after going on gender-affirming hormones and lowering her testosterone into the female range for 12 consecutive months, which would dramatically reduce her legacy male sex advantages insofar as her power, strength, quickness, explosiveness, and endurance are concerned, as Joanna pointed out. But World Rugby wouldn't let her compete in women's rugby at all, because Caitlin is still 6'2" and 200 plus pounds with a male skeletal structure, and they view it as a safety concern. Perhaps the most contentious area of discussion is currently high school sports. Many are presenting a narrative that high school sports are just participatory sports, not competitive sports. So they view categorical inclusion without any mitigation of a transgender girl's male legacy sex advantages as being just fine, just as it is for intramural or co-ed sports. And while there is absolutely no question that if presented properly, sports at all levels, and especially at the high school level, are amazing and even irreplaceable academic, and social tools that everyone should experience. Anyone who has ever competed on their high school team knows they are not just participatory sports. They are ridiculously competitive. Just ask the coaches at over 2,000 US colleges and junior colleges that are recruiting student athletes year-round for their teams in over 29 sports. Another misleading fact that is widely circulated is that there are far too few transgender girls and women competing to make a difference. They say that everyone is making a whole lot of noise about nothing. The real facts are, though, that they said exactly the same thing when Caster Semenya, an intersex athlete or athlete with differences of sexual development, who are not transgender athletes and who in number are many times fewer, first appeared on the international scene in 2009. Yet in 2016, they were singing an entirely different tune when, despite their still small numbers, intersex athletes led by Caster went 1, 2, 3 in the women's Olympic 800-meter final in Rio. The real facts are that just 2 transgender girls who had undergone all or part of male puberty, running high school track in Connecticut for 4 years, impacted the results, records, and experience of their cis girl competitors a total of 235 identified times in just the conference class, state, and New England championships, as well as 3 invitationals, in such varied ways as taking a Connecticut State Team Championship away from 23 females, 11 females lost meet records, 39 were denied places in the finals, 52 were denied places in a championship meet, 93 lost an individual or relay championship, and 17 missed out on making an all New England team. And that's not talking about the lawsuits, all because of just 2 girls. And finally, the real facts are that Bruce, coming out as Caitlin, opened the door, and thousands of transgender athletes are feeling free to be and become themselves. A recent survey by the Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania school district said that 9.2% of 3,168 high school students surveyed had a gender identity that did not fully align with their sex assigned at birth. A recent Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation, GLAAD survey of millennials nationwide found that 12% of them identify as transgender or gender nonconforming, meaning they do not identify with the sex they were assigned at birth, or their gender expression is different from conventional expectations of masculinity and femininity. Doubling the 6% number of transgender and gender nonconforming people reported by Generation X. And anecdotally, Gail Devers, the former 2-time Olympic 100-meter champion, who is now a soccer, lacrosse, and basketball mom of 2 teenage girls in Atlanta, told me recently that there are transgender girls in all of her daughter's leagues. The real facts are that while the current sports participation numbers of transgender athletes are small, the athletes are impactful well beyond their numbers, on and off the field, and the numbers are about to grow dramatically. And we as sports people must build the proper playing field and create the proper environment for them now. We must create the diamond-shaped hole for their diamond-shaped peg before it is too late. And I say we, the sports community, must take the initiative and do this. We cannot allow the courts and legislatures to take the lead. As well-meaning as they might be, they do not know our sports inside and out like we do. and the landscape for them has become politicized beyond the point of no return. Sports leaders must determine what is in the best interest of not only their sports as a whole, but each and every one of their participating athletes. It is sports people who know how to best balance inclusion with competitive fairness and safety in each of their sports. And we have to look no further than the current situation with intersex athletes in track and field to know that we must find and implement fair, inclusive, and sensitive sport by sport solutions based upon real science, logic, and real experience before we lose the control of our sports to the courts. Despite the overwhelming evidence of the women's 800-meter results in Rio and the common knowledge that among the most important of the performance-enhancing drugs and powerful are testosterone and its derivatives, lawyers were able for years to thwart World Athletics' effort to require all intersex athletes to lower their testosterone levels, which are naturally in the male range due to their having testes instead of ovaries and XY chromosomes instead of XX, while competing in the women's category for all events. Instead, the lawyers were able in court to limit the required suppression of their testosterone levels to just the 400 meters up to the mile, where there were sufficient data points, i.e. recent athletic performances by intersex athletes to look at. The end result? World Athletics knew exactly what they were asking for and why. 3 unmitigated intersex athletes made this year's Olympic final in the 200 meters and 10,000 meters, winning 1 silver medal. Won 2 silver medals and 1 gold in the 100 meters and 200 meters at the World Junior Championships. And then set an astounding world record in the women's 2,000 meters, which is 400 meters longer than a mile for those metrically challenged. And back to court they'll go. Our challenge is to balance inclusion and expanding the women's category with competitive fairness for the entire category for all girls and women. My fear and the fear of all international level athletes in my sport that I know and speak with is that if women's sports do not continue to be protected as they currently are internationally, and as women's sport around the and as they have been and still are domestically by statutes such as Title IX, women's sport around the globe as we know it will disappear. And if the same or similar protections don't exist at the developmental level, and in the US, most specifically at the high school level, many of tomorrow's female stars will have stopped competing long before they and the world ever find out how good they are. Because the playing field will be uneven and unequal, and their opportunities in and through the sport will not be clear to them. I've been involved with the National Scholastic Athletics Foundation since its inception over 30 years ago. Its total focus is high school age track and field. And among other programs, we created and run the National Indoor and Outdoor Track and Field Championships for high school age boys and girls each year. Since 1984, a total of 418 of our championships alumni have competed in 751 Olympic events, earning 192 Olympic medals. Yet the great majority of them didn't win our meets in high school. And at least 50% didn't even place. And at the 2016 Olympics, the average age of a US Olympian was 29.6 years old. All of which means that today's great athletes take a long time to develop, and they must be nurtured by many encouraging and positive experiences throughout their journey. And that need for nurturing goes for both cis girls and women and transgender girls and women. We must protect all of them and their rights to compete equally. That was our goal when we first heard about Terry Miller and Andrea Yearwood, two transgender girls beginning to run track in Connecticut some 5 years ago. Our NSAF board set out to create a safe and nurturing place for all of our participants, while protecting the integrity and fairness of the competition within the guidelines of all applicable discrimination laws. Our rules mirror those of our national, international sports federations, USA Track and Field, and World Athletics. Transgender girls are fully included if they have taken gender-affirming hormones in order to mitigate their sex-related competitive advantages and test within the female testosterone range for a period of 12 months before competing in our events, and then of course throughout the competitive period. And in March 2019, Andrea Yearwood became the first openly transgender girl to compete in our indoor nationals. And like virtually every other participant there, while she competed well, she left wanting more. The way it is supposed to be in athletics. She was also, and in some cases, perhaps for the first time, mostly welcomed by her competitors because they were all generally confident that they were competing on an even playing field. And for the spectators and general public, her competing became a non-event. Andrea was a brave pioneer, and we were thrilled to welcome her into the NSAF family in 2019. And now we are looking forward to the next Andrea.
Hey, thanks, Tracy. And now we move from the old man to the young woman who is the first openly transgender athlete to compete in an NCAA championship. Juniper Eastwood is currently an MA candidate in environmental philosophy at the University of Montana, a trail runner and a former track and cross country runner. Juniper, we appreciate your sharing your transition journey from high school through the present and your thoughts on meaningful sport competition.
I have just some concise thoughts on the end here. Hopefully it ties it together. Sorry if at times I'm a little more, I speak like a philosopher when I write. So if there's questions at the end, hopefully we can answer some of those. And sorry if I repeat myself on some of the issues we've already talked about. Just gonna get into it. I probably don't need to say my name. I was just introduced. I'll skip that sentence. Sorry. I guess I'll start with the fact that most everybody here and others we've heard from, I'm in opposition to recent ungrounded legislative efforts that seek to make it impossible for other young people like me to participate in sports. However, like we've talked about here, to fully recognize the history of women's sports, which is generally where the question of inclusion arises. I understand the need to be deliberate when considering the inclusion of transgender athletes. Inclusion in sports carries a high weight in modern society, and the benefits can be life-affirming and altering. Being a runner is part of who I am. Running centers and orients my life, and through it, I am better able to understand myself in the world. I cannot imagine what my life would have been like without the ability to participate in sports with my peers. It had a formative impact on me in middle and high school, and I have participated year-round in sports, in running specifically, for 12 to 13 years. I've recently competed a lot less just with trail running. It's not always super about the competition, which is over half my life, the amount of time I've participated. Participation in sports is about more than winning and losing, as we've talked about. It is about community and personal development. The opportunity to compete alongside the women on my team allowed me to build lasting friendships, and confidence in myself that significantly improved the quality of my life. The lessons and experiences I have gained while participating in the sport of running will help me in future jobs, friendships, and as a member of my community. It is my sincere hope that all people are provided a path sorry, words are hard today, apparently, a path toward the same opportunity to enrich their lives through participation in high school and collegiate sports. To further elaborate on my journey as a runner, I was a successful competitive distance runner throughout high school and college, having ran on a boys or men's team until after my junior year of college. I became a 5-time high school state champion. I was a track and cross country athlete, specifically generally focused somewhere between a mile and 5,000 meters and shorter when I was in high school. And in college, I was the fastest runner on my men's cross country team before transitioning by over a minute at many competitions during the cross country season. However, I did not share much other than the sport of running with my male teammates, and I consistently felt isolated. I had known that I was a girl and woman when I became an adult since I was around 11 or 12 years old. And this was about the same time I discovered the sport of running. Ultimately, running ended up being a major reason I felt unable to come out at an earlier age. And as time went on, I felt increasingly despondent. I thought that if I came out, I would not be able to continue to compete, which would be true in the state that I live in now. At the crux of my collegiate running career, I got injured and was forced to seriously reckon with feelings I had ignored my entire adolescent years. In place of running, a relatively healthy outlet, I started abusing alcohol, eventually getting bad enough that I had virtually no other option but to come out due to strong suicidal feelings, not uncommon in trans people. Where once I thought having the singular identity of runner would be enough, what I ended up finding out was that the sport itself demands that you discover and confront your truest self. I strongly believe that what draws many other people to sports is similar to my experience, and that generally, most people are not singularly focused on winning competitions as their sole purpose. After coming out, I continued to run on a men's track team until starting to undergo hormone therapy following my junior year track season. In accordance with NCAA policy as it stands now, I sat out for nearly 16 months to ensure that my testosterone was sufficiently suppressed. And then I represented my university during a 5th year where I was completing a second bachelor's degree. And NCAA policy, for those not familiar, it's currently 12 months, but I know that's undergoing some sort of revision. Much of my last year competing collegiately is well covered in media and elsewhere, although what is not always fully apparent is the sheer amount of vitriol that I knowingly submitted myself to. I put on my thick skin and weathered it, believing in the principle of inclusion and science like JOANNA's. Running is something that I will engage in for as long as my body allows. In an increasingly distracted world, the focal practice of running helps me quiet and gather my life. It helps me manage and overcome anxiety, allowing me to develop more confidence that has ripple effects in my life and the community around me. Cool. Furthermore, it is worth noting that the debate regarding transgender athlete inclusion in sports is another example of the lack of deliberateness fueled by political polarization, as Tracy was talking about. On the side that views exclusion as the only option, such as the position being forwarded by conservative legislators in some states, not enough attention is paid to both the science surrounding transgender athletes specifically and the lack of clear examples where the inclusion of transgender athletes has irreparably damaged women's sports. To make that clear, there aren't clear examples of that happening. In short, the burden of evidence is not adequate to support that sort of claim. Yet, this does not mean that the opposing viewpoint is any more nuanced. Proponents of inclusion, as Tracy again talked about, generally without any restriction, failed to pay enough attention to both the history of women's sports and clear biological realities. Unfortunately, things are more complex, and only addressing social constructions neglects empirical reality. Given these criticisms, the hard work is in finding a way to include transgender women and girls in sports that is not antithetical to the history and goals of women's sports more generally. In other words, respecting the space that women's sports occupies needs to be prioritized when finding ways to create meaningful opportunities for all potential participants. I do not think that there is a way, I do think that there is a way to balance the two goals, and that a more deliberate and nuanced approach is the appropriate method for doing so. Anti-trans athlete bills are needlessly discriminatory, especially when taking into consideration emerging scientific evidence like JOANNA's. It would be great to see lawmakers address the actual documented issues facing women and girls in sports, issues that I experienced as a college athlete, such as a lack of resources for women's teams and lack of female leadership in coaching staff and athletic departments, for example, among other things. And instead of discussing issues that are maybe above their pay grade because they're not familiar with the sport and the sport policy itself. With a balanced goal of inclusion in mind, I hope that future sports policymakers will be able to carefully consider the issue of transgender participation in sports. So that's what I have for now.
Juniper, a quick question. Sports is like 85% a social construct. When we're in practice, in the locker room, at team meetings, in the bus, traveling, it's social. It's a social environment, and maybe 5 or 10% of the time, it's the 10-second race or the 1-hour game, right? Which was more important to you?
I would say that.
Can you comment on that?
Yeah, I think the thing that I've always thought was most important to me, and what was ultimately the most important to me when I actually made the decision to continue to compete instead of quit, which I think is what most trans women have done historically if they came out, was that 2 years that I would have making friends and spending time with my teammates at practice. That was what mattered to me. I didn't necessarily care about the competition part of it. And largely anymore, the only reason I run is because I enjoy it and it teaches me about myself and the world, not because I really want to compete. There's, and maybe that's not a great argument to make when I'm trying to argue for why they should be allowed to, but yeah, I think the participation aspect is definitely the most important aspect of development and growth for people in sports. And I think that other panelists here have mentioned that as well.
Thank you, June, really. Joanna, can I ask you the same question? When you try to balance the importance of women's sports as a social construct as well as a competitive construct, what was your experience?
Maybe I'm a little more inherently competitive than June, but I would say it's maybe 50-50. I still, I've been competing in my sport for 50 years and I still like to race. But one of the things that has been so very important to me is how I've been accepted by my club mates, both in England and back when I was, especially back when I was in Portland. We had a wonderful team of masters women or women over 40. We were nationally recognized. We won numerous titles, and which was all gratifying. But the fact that was most gratifying was that all of these other women just treated me like any of the other women. And you know, we would train together, we would travel together. And you know, so both of those things have value to me.
I hear you. Okay, so here's where we are. We're at the end of our 2 hours, but here's a promise. Number one, that every single question that's been asked will be answered in our follow-up notes. And number two, you know, thank you so much